Somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago, a group of hominins in what is now Spain carried their dead into a cave. The cave is called the Sima de los Huesos, which translates in English as the Pit of Bones. It is a chamber located at the bottom of a 13-meter vertical shaft in the Atapuerca cave system in northern Spain, and it contains the skeletal remains of at least 28 individuals, representing nearly 7,000 fossil fragments, making it one of the most remarkable concentrations of hominin fossils ever discovered. The hominins who deposited these remains were not modern Homo sapiens. They were an archaic species, probably an early form of Neanderthal, or a close ancestor of the Neanderthal lineage. Among the bones at the bottom of the Cima de los Huesos, researchers found a single stone tool. It is a bifacially worked hand axe made from red quartzite, a material that does not occur naturally in the cave or anywhere nearby. The hand axe is called Excalibur by the researchers who discovered it, and it shows very little evidence of use. It appears to have been placed with the dead rather than deposited accidentally. The significance of this finding, when you allow yourself to think about it carefully, is almost vertiginous. More than 300,000 years ago, before the emergence of modern Homo sapiens, before the Upper Paleolithic explosion of art and symbolic culture that begins around 40,000 years ago, before virtually every artifact we typically associate with the modern human mind, a group of hominins carried their dead to a specific place and left a special object with them. This is not simply a fact about ancient behavior. It is a fact about ancient minds. It is evidence that creatures who are not quite us, who lived in a world we can barely imagine, were already doing something that implies an inner life of extraordinary complexity. They were treating the dead as something more than biological material. They were doing something for the dead that the dead could not benefit from in any practical sense. They were, in some sense, responding to death with meaning. What ancient burial practices reveal about the origin of human consciousness is one of the most contested and most profound questions in all of science. And the evidence from the archaeological record over the past 3 decades has made the question considerably more complex and considerably more interesting than it once appeared. Let's begin with what burial actually implies about the minds of those who practice it. The archaeologist Francesco de Rico at the University of Bordeaux, who has spent decades studying the origins of symbolic behavior in ancient humans, has proposed that intentional burial implies a specific and demanding set of cognitive capacities. It implies, at minimum, that the burying individuals have a concept of death as a state that is different from life, that they recognize the body of the deceased as a person rather than simply an object, that they understand that something has been lost that cannot be recovered, and that they respond to this loss not simply with biological indifference, but with behavior that is directed at the dead person in a way that implies ongoing social or emotional relationship. This last implication is perhaps the most significant. When you bury someone, rather than leaving them where they died, you are doing something for them. You are treating them as if your actions toward them still matter, as if the relationship between you and the dead person has not simply ended with their biological death. You are, in the most basic possible sense, acting as if something persists beyond biological death that is worth responding to. The philosopher Thomas Nagel at NYU, in his famous 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, argued that consciousness is defined by the presence of subjective experience, by there being something it is like to be a particular organism. The question of when in the evolutionary history of our lineage consciousness in this sense first emerged is one that the fossil record cannot directly answer, but burial practices provide indirect evidence, because the behavior they imply requires a specific kind of self-awareness and other awareness that is closely related to what we mean by consciousness. The cognitive archaeologist Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London, who has been at the center of debates about human origins for 4 decades, has argued that the evidence for intentional burial in archaic humans needs to be evaluated carefully, because the concept of intentional burial covers a wide range of behaviors with very different cognitive implications. At the simplest end, intentional burial might simply mean placing a body in a location that protects it from scavengers, behavior that might be motivated by something as simple as the distress response to seeing a group member's body disturbed. At the most cognitively demanding end, intentional burial with grave goods, with objects placed specifically for the use or benefit of the dead, implies beliefs about what the dead person might need after death, which in turn implies beliefs about what happens after death. The Cima de los Huesos hand axe falls somewhere in the complex middle of this continuum. it is not clear that it was placed with the dead for their use in an afterlife. But it is also difficult to explain its presence by any process other than deliberate placement. And its presence in a location that required significant effort to reach, in a context with a high density of hominin remains suggesting repeated or sustained use, makes accidental deposition increasingly implausible. The most systematic evidence for intentional burial among archaic humans comes from the Neanderthals, who occupied Europe and parts of Western Asia from approximately 400,000 to 40,000 years ago. The evidence for Neanderthal burial has been debated intensely for more than a century, and the debate has not been fully resolved. But the accumulation of evidence from sites including Shanidar in Iraq, La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, La Ferracie in France, and Kebara in Israel has convinced most, but not all researchers that at least some Neanderthal individuals were intentionally buried rather than simply left where they died. The Shanidar cave site in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan has been particularly important and particularly controversial in these discussions. It was excavated in the late 1950s and 1960s by the anthropologist Ralph Solecki of Columbia University, who discovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals. One of these individuals, known as Shanidar IV, was found in association with large quantities of pollen from multiple flowering plant species. Solecki interpreted this as evidence that the dead Neanderthal had been buried with flowers, and the image of Neanderthals placing flowers on the graves of their dead became one of the most powerful and most widely reproduced icons in the popular understanding of human evolution. The flower burial interpretation has since been substantially questioned. The archaeologist Robert Gargett at the University of Queensland argued in an influential 1989 paper that many apparently intentional Neanderthal burials could be explained by natural processes, including the accumulation of bones by water action, the activities of carnivores, and the collapse of cave roofs. And subsequent analysis of the Shanidar IV pollen has suggested that the flowers may have been introduced by burrowing rodents rather than by deliberate human deposition. But the critique of Neanderthal burial evidence has itself been contested. The paleoanthropologist João Zilhão at the University of Barcelona has argued that the cumulative evidence for Neanderthal burial is stronger than Gargett's critique allows, and that the skeptical position requires us to explain an implausibly large number of coincidences. The pattern of Neanderthal remains in certain cave sites, with bodies placed in pits that appear to have been deliberately dug, in positions that suggest deliberate arrangement, in context with associated artifacts, is difficult to account for without some component of intentional behavior. The debate has been partially, but not fully resolved, by newer evidence from sites excavated more recently with more sophisticated methods. The site of Roc de Marsal in the Dordogne region of France, reanalyzed using modern excavation and dating techniques, has provided what many researchers consider the most rigorous evidence yet for deliberate Neanderthal burial of a child, with the body placed in a natural depression that shows signs of modification and protected by overlying sediments in a way that appears inconsistent with natural accumulation. What makes the Neanderthal burial evidence so significant for questions about consciousness is not simply that it shows Neanderthals treating their dead with some form of attention and care. It is what the burial evidence, taken together with other evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior, implies about the structure of the Neanderthal mind. The question of whether Neanderthals had symbolic thought, the capacity to use arbitrary symbols to represent concepts, relationships, and ideas that are not directly present in the immediate environment, has been one of the most contested questions in paleoanthropology for decades. The traditional view was that symbolic thought was the exclusive possession of modern Homo sapiens, that it emerged sometime around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago in what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic revolution, and that it was associated with the cognitive abilities that enabled modern humans to displace or absorb the Neanderthals. This view has been significantly challenged in recent years by evidence for symbolic behavior in Neanderthals predating their contact with modern humans. Pigment use at sites in Spain and Gibraltar suggests that Neanderthals were using ochre and other pigments to color their bodies or objects tens of thousands of years before the arrival of modern humans in Europe. Eagle talons and feathers found at multiple Neanderthal sites have been interpreted as personal ornaments, suggesting that Neanderthals were adorning themselves with symbolic objects, and cave art at 3 sites in Spain has been dated to more than 65,000 years ago, predating the arrival of modern humans in Europe by approximately 20,000 years, raising the possibility that Neanderthals were making cave paintings. The cave art dating has been particularly controversial because the dating method used, uranium-thorium dating of cave formations overlying the art, depends on assumptions about the rate of mineral deposition that some researchers have questioned. But if the dates are correct, they substantially change our picture of the cognitive capacities of archaic humans and push the origin of symbolic behavior considerably further back in evolutionary time. The paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall at the American Museum of Natural History, who has written extensively about the evolution of human cognition, has proposed that the evidence from burial practices and from symbolic behavior more generally points toward a view of human consciousness that is not simply on or off, not simply present in modern humans and absent in all other species, but that evolved gradually and in multiple dimensions across the evolutionary history of our lineage. Tattersall argues that the cognitive abilities associated with what we call consciousness emerged through a series of incremental biological changes, each of which added a dimension of cognitive complexity, without necessarily producing what we would recognize as full human self-awareness. The capacity to represent the mental states of others, the capacity to understand death as a state rather than simply a transition, the capacity to use arbitrary symbols, the capacity to imagine counterfactual scenarios, and the capacity to plan for the distant future may have emerged at different times and in different combinations in different hominin lineages. On this account, the Sima de los Huesos hominins who carried their dead into the pit may not have had anything like the full richness of modern human consciousness, but they may have had something, a capacity for social bonding that extended beyond biological death, a recognition that the dead person was in some sense still present, still worthy of response, a behavior that, however primitive by comparison with the elaborate mortuary practices of later human cultures, crossed the threshold that separates purely biological response to death from something that begins to deserve the name meaning. The anthropologist David Graeber at the London School of Economics, before his death in 2020, made an observation in his work on the origins of human culture that is directly relevant here. Graeber argued that the capacity for imaginative play, for pretending that things are other than they are, and for treating the products of imagination as real enough to act upon, is one of the most fundamental and most neglected features of human cognition. The child who treats a stick as a sword is doing something cognitively remarkable. They are maintaining two representations simultaneously, the stick as it actually is, and the stick as they are pretending it to be, and they are acting on the second while being perfectly aware of the first. Burial, Graeber suggested, is one of the earliest and most profound expressions of this human capacity. The dead body is treated as if it is still a person, as if the social relationship is still active, as if the dead might still need or benefit from the offerings placed with them. This is not, or not only, a failure to understand that the person is dead. It is the deliberate and self-aware choice to act as if something is true that may or may not be true, to respond to a reality that cannot be directly perceived, to treat the imagined as real enough to act upon. This capacity, the capacity to act on the basis of beliefs about realities that cannot be directly verified, is at the heart of everything we recognize as distinctively human: religion, law, money, political authority, art, science. All of these are systems that require human beings to treat the products of collective imagination as real enough to structure their behavior. And the evidence that this capacity was already being expressed in some form more than 300,000 years ago, in the dark of the Sima de los Huesos, by creatures who were not quite us, but who were already doing something that looks, from our vantage point, unmistakably like us, is one of the most remarkable facts that the archaeological record has produced. The origin of human consciousness is not a single event. It is a long, deep, tangled process, reaching back much further than we once thought, expressed in forms more varied and more ancient than the simple story of a cognitive revolution 40,000 years ago allowed. And it began to begin, in the dark, with the dead, and with whatever it meant to carry them somewhere, and to stay. The question of what exactly it means to have a concept of death, and what cognitive architecture is required to have such a concept, has been examined most carefully not by archaeologists, but by developmental and comparative psychologists, and their findings add another dimension to the interpretation of ancient burial evidence. The psychologist Michael Slaughter at the University of Queensland has studied the development of death concepts in children and found that a full understanding of death requires the integration of several distinct conceptual components that children acquire at different ages and in a reliable sequence. These components include universality, the understanding that all living things die; irreversibility, the understanding that death is permanent; non-functionality, the understanding that all biological functions cease at death; and causality, the understanding that death has physical causes. Children typically begin to grasp these components between the ages of 4 and 10, with the full integration of all 4 components usually not achieved until middle childhood. Before this integration is complete, children may understand some aspects of death without others, believing, for example, that death happens to others, but not to themselves, or that death is temporary rather than permanent. The relevance of this developmental research to the interpretation of ancient burial practices is significant. A species or lineage that intentionally buries its dead is demonstrating, at minimum, an understanding of universality and irreversibility, the understanding that the dead individual will not return and that something must be done about the body. But the presence of grave goods implies something more, a belief about what happens after death, which implies a concept of death as something other than simple non-existence. The cognitive scientist Pascal Boyer at Washington University in St. Louis, who has studied the cognitive foundations of religious belief across cultures, has proposed that beliefs about the dead, and specifically beliefs that the dead continue in some form after biological death, are not learned cultural beliefs, but are the default outputs of specific cognitive systems that are active in all normally developing human minds. Boyer's account draws on the observation that across virtually all human cultures, the dead are believed to persist in some form, whether as spirits, ancestors, souls, or ghosts, and that these beliefs show remarkable structural similarities despite being expressed in very different cultural idioms. Boyer argues that this universality is not coincidental. It reflects the operation of what he calls agent detection systems, cognitive mechanisms that are highly sensitive to evidence of agency in the environment, and that are prone to false positives, detecting agency where none exists. When applied to the dead, these systems continue to generate representations of the dead person as an agent with beliefs, desires, and intentions, even after biological death has removed the actual agent. This account of why humans believe in souls and spirits is relevant to the interpretation of burial practices because it suggests that the cognitive foundations of mortuary behavior may be present in any species with sufficiently sophisticated agent detection systems. And the evidence for theory of mind, for the ability to model the beliefs and intentions of others, in Neanderthals and in earlier archaic humans, suggests that these cognitive foundations may be considerably older than the archaeological evidence for symbolic behavior has traditionally been taken to imply. The archaeologist Paul Pettitt at Durham University, who has written the most comprehensive recent treatment of Paleolithic mortuary practices in his 2011 book The Paleolithic Origins of Human Burial, distinguishes between what he calls proto-funerary behavior and fully symbolic mortuary practices. Proto-funerary behavior, which Pettitt believes can be traced back at least to the time of the Sima de los Huesos deposit, involves treating the body of a dead group member in a way that goes beyond simple biological reaction, that shows some evidence of attention, care, or deliberate placement, without necessarily implying the full symbolic framework of beliefs about death and afterlife that characterizes fully developed mortuary practices. Fully symbolic mortuary practices, by contrast, involve the use of objects and behaviors that represent abstract ideas and that communicate meaning within a shared symbolic system. The placement of tools and ornaments with the dead, the use of ochre to paint corpses, the construction of elaborate burial structures, and the performance of rituals at burial sites are all examples of fully symbolic mortuary behavior that implies a rich inner life and a complex shared cultural framework for understanding death. Pettit's distinction is useful because it allows us to acknowledge the evidence for ancient mortuary behavior without being forced into the impossible position of claiming either that archaic humans had exactly the same relationship to death as modern humans, or that they had no relationship to death at all. The spectrum between these poles is where the most interesting evidence lies, and navigating it requires the kind of careful attention to the details of specific sites and specific finds that the best paleoanthropological research provides. What this careful attention reveals, across the full span of the evidence from the Sima de los Huesos, through the Neanderthals, to the earliest modern humans, is a picture of gradual and cumulative cognitive evolution, in which each generation of hominins inherited a slightly more complex set of cognitive tools than its predecessors, and applied those tools to the perennial human problems of understanding death, maintaining social bonds, and making sense of existence in a world that does not come pre-labeled with meaning. The tools were not always the same, the beliefs were not always the same, the practices were not always the same. But the underlying project, the project of responding to death with something more than biological indifference, of treating the dead as still deserving of attention and response, and perhaps even care, appears to be one of the oldest and most persistent features of the hominin mind. And it began, as nearly as we can tell, in a cave in Spain, more than 300,000 years ago, with bones and a single red stone. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.